There is something you have probably never said out loud to anyone, that you feel things in a way that doesn't seem normal, that when something hurts, it doesn't just hurt on the surface. It goes somewhere deep inside you, somewhere that takes a long time to reach and an even longer time to leave. That when something is beautiful, a piece of music, a moment, a conversation that actually meant something, you don't just notice it. You are moved by it in a way that you can't fully explain and have long since stopped trying to. You feel everything, and you feel it more than most people around you seem to. And for most of your life, you've been told, directly or indirectly, that this is a problem. Too sensitive, too emotional, too much. You internalize things too deeply. You need to toughen up. You need to let things go. You need to stop caring so much about everything. So over time, you tried, you built walls. You learned to perform a version of yourself that felt less, that reacted less, that gave the world a composed, unbothered surface it seemed to be asking for. But underneath that surface, you still felt everything. You just felt alone. Here is what nobody told you, and what psychology has been quietly confirming for decades. What you carry is not a flaw. It is not fragility. It is not something that needs to be fixed or managed or medicated into stillness. It is one of the rarest and most extraordinary configurations the human mind can possess. And the world has been misreading it, and misreading you for your entire life. Let's begin with the science, because this is not sentiment. This is neurology. Researchers studying emotional processing have identified a trait present in approximately 15 to 20% of the human population. It was first formally described by psychologist Dr. Elaine Aron in the 1990s, and she called it sensory processing sensitivity. In common language, people who carry this trait are often described as highly sensitive persons. But that label, for all its clinical accuracy, dramatically undersells what is actually happening inside the mind of someone who has it. Because this is not simply about being sensitive to emotions. It is about the depth at which the entire nervous system processes information. Emotional, sensory, social, intellectual, all of it. The highly sensitive mind does not just receive input. It processes it at multiple layers simultaneously. It cross-references it against memory, against meaning, against consequence. It feels the weight of things that most nervous systems simply pass through without registering. In brain imaging studies, individuals with high sensory processing sensitivity show significantly greater activation in the areas of the brain associated with empathy, awareness, and depth of processing. Their brains are not broken. They are running a more complex program. They are doing more, far more, with every single piece of information that enters them. The pain you have felt for feeling too much is not evidence of weakness. It is a cause of operating a system that most people simply do not have access to. But let's go deeper than the clinical definition. Because inside the experience of feeling everything deeply, there are specific gifts, rare, powerful, and almost entirely unrecognized, that deserve to be named directly. The first is an emotional intelligence, so precise it functions almost like a second language. Most people experience emotions the way they experience weather, something that happens to them, something they react to, something that passes. But people who feel deeply have an entirely different relationship with the emotional world. They don't just experience emotion. They read it. They speak it fluently, instinctively, in themselves and in everyone around them. You know when someone is not okay before they say a word. You feel the shift in a room before anyone has acknowledged it. You understand what someone meant beneath what they actually said, and more importantly, you understand what they felt but were unable to say at all. This is not imagination. This is a calibrated emotional perception system that operates continuously, processing layers of human experience that most people never consciously access. In every relationship, every room, every conversation, you are receiving and interpreting information that others are simply not equipped to detect. Psychologists who study emotional intelligence have found that this depth of emotional perception is directly correlated with the ability to lead with compassion, to connect authentically, to navigate complex human dynamics with wisdom rather than force. The world's most effective therapists, leaders, artists, and healers almost universally share this trait, not because they were trained to feel deeply, but because they always did. The second gift is an aesthetic and sensory experience of life that most people never come close to touching. When you hear a piece of music that moves you, it does not just move you, it opens something. When you stand in a landscape that is beautiful, you don't just see it. You feel the weight of it, the meaning of it, something almost inexplicable that rises in your chest and makes the ordinary world feel suddenly and briefly sacred. This is not melodrama. This is a documented feature of the highly sensitive nervous system, an amplified aesthetic response that gives certain people access to beauty at frequency and depth that most human beings genuinely cannot perceive. Think about every piece of art that has ever changed the way you understand being alive. Every novel that felt like it was written directly to some hidden part of you. Every film, every song, every conversation that rearranged something in you permanently. The people who created those things, without exception, felt the world the way you do. They were not creators who later became sensitive. They were sensitive first, and that sensitivity was the source of everything they built. The depth at which you experience life is the same depth from which all meaningful human creation has ever emerged. That is not a coincidence. The third gift is a moral and ethical awareness that operates below the level of social conditioning. People who feel deeply are often deeply troubled by injustice, not because they've been taught to be, but because they feel the wrongness of it directly. They cannot detach from the suffering of others the way social convenience might prefer. They cannot watch something unfair unfold and simply move on. Something in them registers it as a wound, even when it has happened to someone they have never met and will never know. This is called empathic resonance, and it is among the most important psychological capacities the human species possesses. It is the foundation of every ethical framework, every movement toward justice, every moment in history when someone decided that the suffering of a stranger mattered enough to act. The people who built the moral architecture of civilization, the abolitionists, the reformers, the whistleblowers, the quiet revolutionaries who refused and normalized cruelty, were almost universally people who felt too much, who could not build the emotional distance that indifference requires, who were inconvenienced repeatedly and sometimes devastatingly by their own inability to stop caring. Your inconvenient empathy is not weakness, it is conscience. And conscience at scale is the only thing that has ever actually made the world better. The fourth gift is a depth of thought that turns ordinary experiences into extraordinary understanding. When something happens to a person who feels deeply, they do not simply process it and file it away. They live inside it. They turn it, examine it, feel their way through its every dimension until they understand not just what happened, but what it means, what it reveals, what it connects to. This is why people who feel deeply are often the ones who arrive at understanding that others never reach. Not because they are more intelligent in the conventional sense, but because they are willing to stay inside and experience long enough to extract everything it has to teach. Psychologists call this depth of processing, and it is precisely this quality that produces wisdom, not the quick, surface-level pattern recognition that passes for intelligence in most contexts, but the slow, thorough, layered comprehension that only comes from being willing to feel something all the way to its bottom. Every person in your life who has ever come to you in their darkest moment, every friend who called you first, every stranger who somehow told you the truth, they came because they sensed this in you. They sensed that you would not flinch from the depth of what they were carrying, that you had been there yourself, that you could meet them where they actually were. That is not a small thing. That is one of the rarest and most sacred things one human being can offer another. The fifth gift is an extraordinary capacity for meaning, which is a foundation of a truly lived life. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who developed logotherapy, wrote that the primary human drive is not pleasure, not power, not success, but meaning, the search for a life that matters, for experiences that are felt as real and significant and worth having been alive for. People who feel deeply do not have to search for meaning the way others do. They encounter it constantly, in the details, in the connections, in the moments that pass by most people without leaving a mark. A conversation at the right time, a book that changes the shape of something in you, a sunset that, for reasons you could never fully explain, makes you feel the strange and overwhelming gift of being alive. This capacity for meaning, for experiencing life as something worth feeling rather than simply something to survive, is, in the end, the fullest expression of what it means to be human, and you have access to it every single day. Now here is a reframe, and it matters. Everything described here has a cost. The overwhelm is real. The exhaustion of feeling everything in a world that often feels like it produces nothing but more things to feel. That is real. The loneliness of carrying depths that most conversations can never reach. That is real and valid and deserving of acknowledgement. But the cost is not evidence that something is wrong with you. The cost is the price of admission to a way of experiencing life that most people will never know is even possible. You are not built for a shallow life. And the difficulty you have had living one is not failure. It is incompatibility of being designed for depth, repeatedly asked to stay at the surface. You do not need to fix how deeply you feel. You need an environment, relationships, and a life that are finally deep enough to hold you. The world will keep telling you that feeling less is the answer, that armor is strength, that distance is safety, that the goal is to be less affected, less moved, less touched by the weight of being alive. But the people who have changed how the world understands itself, the artists, the healers, the truth-tellers, the ones who loved so completely that it outlasted them, they were not the ones who felt less. They were the ones who refused to. You feel everything deeply because you are built to. Because the world needs people who cannot look away from beauty or pain or truth. Because somewhere at the bottom of every feeling you have ever had that seemed like too much, there is something real, something worth knowing, something the world needs someone to be willing to feel all the way through. That someone is you. It has always been you. And the depth you carry, the depth that has made your life harder and quieter and sometimes unbearably full, is the same depth from which everything we're leaving behind is eventually made. If this found something in you that has been waiting a long time to be found, stay here. This channel exists for the minds that feel more than they can say and think more than they can show. There is more here for you.